Mind is not just embodied, it's also relational. Okay, so we can say then the mind can be defined, it's a working definition, as an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy information. Now you may say, well, that sounds really natural. You may not agree, you may agree, but it's actually a working definition. And what's really striking is when you sit down with scientists who study the mind, let's say like psychologists or brain scientists who are interested in the mind, even philosophers who study the mind, which is what I've had the opportunity to do, here's the striking thing. Almost none of them will define the mind. And they'll say things like, the mind is undefinable, or the human mind shouldn't be defined, or will be limited if we define it because we don't know everything about it. So what I say in response to that is, I totally get those concerns, but if we don't define a word, how can we actually use the word with each other? Why would we have a word? And some people say, well, it's just a placeholder for something we really don't understand. And that's okay, and then you're still in the dark. You're still doing what we've done in mental health for all these years. When you define the mind as a process that regulates the flow of energy and information, it changes what you can do for defining a healthy mind. It also changes, in a very practical way, the approach you can take to strengthen the mind. Let me give you an example. If you buy into it, just for now, the notion that the mind is a regulatory process, what does it take to regulate? If you say, just on the simplest level, I want to take a person coming to me as a friend or coming to me professionally if you're a therapist, and I want to strengthen their mind. At a minimum, what do you need to do? What does it take to regulate something? Anyone here in engineering? Okay, you need to measure it. You need to have some way to measure or monitor the thing that you're regulating. And we're saying the thing is energy and information flow. So at a very minimum, you need to have a way to monitor and measure, maybe not quantitatively, but to assess, to monitor, to observe that which you're going to influence, which is the second thing in regulation. If you're driving a car and you're watching, if someone has tied your hands behind your back and tied your feet together, you can't influence the thing that you're trying to regulate. So monitoring and modifying are the two essential components of regulation. So once we define the mind, especially in this way, you get a new insight into how to actually create a stronger mind. You'd be amazed, but a lot of people live their lives just having thoughts and feelings, beliefs and attitudes, having hopes and dreams and memories and perceptions, all the stuff that we can use to describe the mind. Those aren't definitions, they're descriptions of mental activity. But they haven't developed the capacity to actually observe those mental activities as the flow of energy and information, as the mind itself. So that process of being able to see mental activity with more clarity and then modify it with more efficacy is something that you can name with the word mind sight. This ability to actually see your mind, not just have one. Now, it may sound kind of almost simplistic, but when you look at different areas of research, what you find is that when mind sight is present, various ways of understanding mental health are also present. There's something about being able to see and influence your internal world that creates more health. I'll give you an example. Let's say someone had a huge feeling of anger going on inside of them, and they had no way of monitoring that. Would the anger go away? No, they'd still have anger, right? The anger would still be changing their physiology, but they wouldn't have the capacity to have what's called discernment, to take a step away from mental activity and notice, I have anger. The anger would sweep them up, and if you're an 8-year-old on the playground of a school and someone takes your ball, you may slug that kid, right? So we've done studies at UCLA using mindfulness techniques, one way of teaching a way to monitor and modify internal states, and even in preschool kids using certain very basic mindfulness techniques we've been able to show that you can decrease bullying. You can increase empathy. You can increase the capacity for kids to pause before they act. We've even done a pilot study at UCLA where if you teach mindfulness techniques, which I'll tell you about in a moment, you actually can take people with attention deficit problems where they can't regulate energy and information flow, and you can actually, as adults and older teenagers, you can change the way their executive functions of their brain function just by teaching them mental training. So what I'd like to do is dive deeply with you into this notion of, once we have a definition of the mind, can we define a healthy mind? And then look at a way of thinking about this and think, well, how does this work in our personal lives? How does this work in a life where you're involved in energy and information transfer around the globe? How does it work in the interface between a human being and a computer? These are all relevant areas where understanding how you see the mind and defining the mind may be of benefit. So the first thing we'll say is that in common neuroscience, there's a statement that you may have read about, which is, the mind is just the activity of the brain. How many of you have heard that? Yep. Okay, so if you read any of the really well-regarded neuroscientist writers who either write their research papers or write for the general public, this is basically what's said. And I'm going to suggest to you that that view is only part of the story. That instead, we can think of a triangle where there are 3 points on this triangle. One point is the brain, the extended nervous system distributed throughout the whole body, which can be thought of as a mechanism by which energy and information flow. Then there's the point of relationships, which is where there's a sharing of energy and information flow. And then there's the point of the mind, which is the process that regulates this flow. And these 3 points on the triangle have arrows going in all directions. So unlike what you might read if you read common neuroscience books, where the arrow is one direction, these arrows in all directions. And it's not even as simple as just there's the mind and the brain. You can't understand human experience, I'll have you consider, without thinking about relationships. We go to that attachment figure to help soothe us. So here you see, from 200 million years ago, we as mammals have needed each other to survive. We've needed each other to help regulate our energy and information flow. We are, as a class of mammals, extremely social. That now we know from research are based on, that is, they need a healthy middle prefrontal area to function well. And you just think about in your own life what role these 9 functions play in yourself, in your relationships with others, in people you know. And here are the 9 functions. The first is, this area of the brain actually sits on top of the brainstem, as you can see from where it is, and it helps regulate it. So regulating the body, the heart, the lungs, is actually what this part contributes to, body regulation. Number 2 is, you know when you look at another person in the face and you feel like you're connected to them and you attune to them? That attuned communication depends on this middle prefrontal area. And when it's damaged, people don't do that. And you can try it right now if you want to. Look at each other and see what it's like when you just look at someone you feel connected versus when one of you looks away. Give it a try. Just see what that's like. Look at your neighbor. Try looking and then just look, even just look away and see the difference in the feeling. Each of you try on the left side, do the looking away first. And then on this side, now try switching it over. How did it feel differently when someone was actually looked like they felt like they were tuning into you versus not? Did you notice a difference? Yeah, everyone's nodding their head. There's a huge difference, and the prefrontal region can create it and knows the difference. Number 3 is to be able to balance your emotions, to let these internal valence states, we call emotions, rise enough so life has meaning, but not rise too much so life becomes chaotic, and not be too depleted so life becomes rigid. That optimal flow, which we'll talk about in just a moment, that optimal flow is what this area helps create. The 4th function is the capacity to extinguish fear. If you've been traumatized or it's a difficult thing and you're frightened of it, this area actually grows what are called GABA fibers. Gamma aminobutyric acid is an inhibitory peptide that helps dampen down firing, and the lower limbic area, the amygdala, is responsible for generating activations that are what help us feel fear. So this middle prefrontal area helps calm that down. That's number 4. Number 5 is the ability to pause before you act, what I call response flexibility. To, instead of just active, just respond to your impulse, to pause, have a space in your mind where you consider the various options available to you. For a kid on a playground, this is absolutely all the difference between being adaptive and flexible with emotional intelligence and social intelligence, or lacking those things. That ability to pause before you act is everything. And if you could just teach kids that, you'd be making a huge difference in public schools. That's number 5. Number 6 is something called insight, which scientifically means something called autonoetic consciousness, which is self-knowing awareness. And in the brain, what we think that does is there are representations of the past that are connected with representations of the present and anticipated future. So you have this thing called mental time travel. The next one is the capacity for empathy. Different from attunement, empathy is the ability to tune into someone else and to create maps of them in your mind. I wonder what that person's feeling. I wonder what she was thinking. I wonder what memories might have come up that made her behave that way. That's an example. Those are examples of empathy. And then number 8, if you thought that those 7 weren't enough, number 8 is the capacity for morality, for actually thinking about the importance of compassion, of using your moral imagination to think about the larger social good and then enacting those behaviors even when you're alone. It's a way of defining morality. People with damage to this area, they don't become immoral, they become amoral. What I'm going to propose to you, and this is in all of my different writings that Meng talked about, so you can see the detailed analysis and the references to the science. This is just kind of the take-home message and a kind of an overview. The proposal I'm going to make to you is that a healthy mind emerges from integrated systems. Integration, very clearly defined as the linkage of differentiated parts, so that when you have a nervous system that's integrated, you get these 9 functions. When you see relationships in a family that are integrated, where people are honored for their differences but linked, they want to, how are you doing? How are you doing? Okay, you like vanilla ice cream, you like chocolate, fine. But let's go out for ice cream together. That's a healthy, adaptive family. You get flexibility, adaptability, even a sense of coherence. If you look at the mathematics of coherence, it's a beautiful book by Thiergaard called Coherence in Thought and Action, which examines the equations beneath coherence. And these integrated systems get that, where they embed the ongoing variables that they're encountering into how they define the in and out group. And the system then moves through time by changing in response to what it experiences. Different from a cohesive equation, which is rigid in how it's defining things, and it just doesn't change. You're either in or you're out, odd numbers out, even numbers in. Whatever the system is, it doesn't adapt. So we're talking about relationships and a brain as systems of energy information flow that when they're integrated, they can move in this adaptive way. Now, in my own journey through all this stuff, what blew my mind was not only being trained as a clinician and finding it actually useful to name specific domains of integration, like the left hemisphere and the right, having them become differentiated and linked, like the body and the cortex, having them linked, just as 2 examples. There's all sorts of domains of integration that can outline a whole approach to promoting a healthy mind. But one very direct approach, which has been around for, it turns out, thousands of years, was taught to me only very recently because I, by accident, used the word mindfulness in a book on parenting. And I said, with my co-author Mary Hartzell, that one of the most important things we can do is be intentional and awake in our parenting. We use the English word mindfulness. It turned out, as you may know, that there's 2,500 years of specific mental training to develop mindfulness traits, which I wasn't aware of. But since that time, I was fortunate enough to meet people who've been spending their life in modern times studying scientifically the power of mental training to promote, it turns out, and this totally blew my mind, it turned out to promote all 9 of the middle prefrontal functions. And when I presented this to one of our nation's leaders, John Kabat-Zinn, on this, he was beautifully able to say that it wasn't just that this was the outcome of mindfulness training to get these 9 functions. It turned out it was the way of being mindful, to regulate your body, to balance your emotions, to be tuned into other people, to be flexible in your responses. All these things, to have insight, empathy, moral living, even intuition, 100% of them. So in a book called The Mindful Brain, what I wrote about was integrative processes that link differentiated components. Those are integrative. Like a parent's tuning into a child. Promote the activation of these integrated fibers in the brain and promote their growth. It turned out that there were studies to suggest, in fact, that when you do this thing called mindfulness training, there's the kind that's been studied in depth is mindfulness meditation, but there are also other trainings that we think will do the same thing. We don't know, like yoga and Tai Chi and Qigong and centering prayer. Those are all mindfulness practices. But for now, the bulk of research, scientific research, has been done on mindfulness meditation. But there's lots of ways of practicing mindfulness. For that research, these are the areas that get activated. And the neuroscience lesson is that neurons which fire together wire together. So if you have a practice, let's say 10 minutes a day even, where you are taking time to focus, let's say, on the breath, and when your mind wanders, return your attention to the breath in a loving and kind way, and then your mind gets distracted, return your attention. To have this practice where you're aware of your awareness and you're paying attention to your intention. We believe that those are the 2 fundamental things in every mindfulness practice. When you do that over and over again, in that 10-minute period, you're creating what's called a mindfully aware state, a state of mindful awareness. Now you may say, well, is that just the same as relaxation? Well, the answer is no. It turns out studies have been done and show that mindfulness training is not the same as relaxation training. You may feel calm or you may not feel calm, but it's a form of mindful awareness which is very different from just relaxing. That's number one. You say, well, okay, I'm doing it 10 minutes a day. Well, how is that going to help me? Good 10 minutes. What about the rest of my day? Here's the secret. When you intentionally practice firing off neurons, you stimulate neuronal activation and growth. You snag the brain, stimulate neuronal activation and growth. When you create those states, they will change the structure of the brain, and subsequent studies have actually shown that that's true, to make a mindfulness trait. States become traits with practice. That's the whole idea. So what I'm suggesting to you is that we've defined a healthy mind coming from integrated relationships and an integrated nervous system. We've described its features, and now here's the last few minutes before we stop for questions, is how do you actually do this? Well, one thing is you try to promote healthy relationships with other people. You tune into not just their thoughts, but their internal world, their nonverbal signals. You combine in every way you can a way of attuning to people's internal worlds and respecting their ability to be distinct from you. That's a relational one. In the brain, you can actually, on your own, develop, and you can call it an integrative practice if you don't like the word mindfulness, but it's basically a way of focusing energy and information flow in a way that has you be aware of your awareness, pay attention to your intention, and basically build the muscle of the mind.